Good evening, and welcome to the UCLA History Department's Why History Matters series. I'm Darnell Hunt, Dean of Social Sciences at UCLA. Over the course of 14 days, beginning January 6th and ending January 20th, our country will have experienced a deadly siege on our capital by Americans, the second impeachment of the President of the United States, and the inauguration of a new president and the first female African American and Asian American vice president. It is without question that we are living through unparalleled times. In a moment like this, as we struggle to make sense of the world around us, scholars of history are critically important. They help us to contextualize the events of today by looking to our past. And tonight's conversation couldn't be more timely. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Carla Pestana, Chair and Professor of the History Department.
Thank you, Dean Hunt. I'm Carla Pestana, Chair of the History Department at UCLA, and I am honored to welcome alumni, friends, and community partners to the department's second Why History Matters event of the academic year. Thank you all for joining us to learn from our experts during this unprecedented time in our nation's history. The department is proud to be at the forefront of national conversations during these unparalleled attacks on democracy, which have occurred before, during, and since the 2020 presidential election. Why History Matters is a series that brings together scholars and community leaders to discuss important issues in their historical and contemporary contexts. Today's discussion will offer insights into our current moment by examining the history of notable presidential transitions of the past. I'm pleased to introduce our panel. Emeritus Professor Joan Waugh is a UCLA historian of 19th century US history, especially of the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the Gilded Age. Margaret O'Mara, the Howard and Francis Keller Endowed Professor of the University of Washington, specializes in modern American politics. Finally, our esteemed moderator is UCLA historian Robin Kelley, who is distinguished professor and holds the Gary B. Nash Endowed Chair in U.S. History. And now I will turn it over to Robin.
Okay. Thank you, Carla. I can't think of a more opportune and actually more chilling moment to have this conversation. And we've been watching this crisis unfold since Trump and his people began contesting the results of the election. And remember, that contestation began before November 3rd. Then on January 6th, as Dean Hunt pointed out, we witnessed events that have been called unprecedented in American history: an insurrection and violent invasion of the US Capitol by alt-right racists, neo-Nazis, and assorted fascist gangs, partly incited by the sitting president of the United States. And of course, those actions have led to a second impeachment. It was planned weeks, if not months in advance, by leaders of movements that have been mobilizing for years. And many insurrectionists came from the ranks of the military and the police. Some of us could have predicted these events. Others were completely caught off guard. Media outlets scrambled to find historians to put these unprecedented events in context. It's been called our Weimar moment, America's Kristallnacht. Most US historians compare January 6th to the violent overthrow of the democratically elected government of Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898. Pundits commented disparagingly that this kind of thing happens in a banana republic, not America. And for others, it was the classic case of the chickens coming home to roost, expressed in a statement issued by the Republic of Venezuela that, quote, the United States is experiencing what it has generated in other countries with its policies of aggression. But to really understand the events of January 6th requires that we pull back the lens to see the historic Senate victories in Georgia on January 5th, in spite of that state's ongoing voter suppression, to see the events of November 3rd and the months that followed, to see the uprising of the summer of 2020, for example, to see the year-long pandemic that we've experienced, and to see the 4 disastrous years of Trump's presidency, and also to see the kind of global turn to authoritarianism. Fortunately for us, we have Professors Joan Waugh and Margaret O'Mara, who will pull back the lens even further by looking at other pivotal presidential elections. Joan will help us understand the significance and consequences of the 1876 elections, and Margaret, the 1932 elections that brought us the New Deal state. So they have a lot to teach us. So with that, I'll turn it over to Joan.
Thank you, Robin. And good afternoon to you all, or good early evening, whichever you prefer. Recently, the 1876 election has enjoyed a new prominence as some Senate Republicans announced they wanted Congress to reject electors from a few states and instead demanded that Congress form a commission and investigate claims of voter fraud in the election of 2020. In support of the action, they cited the election of 1876 as a precedent. That commission didn't happen because, unlike 1876, there was no evidence to support the claim, and the end of it came with the current vice president's refusal to override the certified results of the 2020 election. Many scholars have described the analogy made between the two elections as misleading, even dangerous. Let's consider then the 1876 fateful election on its own and make our decision on the comparison today. What I'm going to do in the very short time provided to me is to briefly review the campaign and the ensuing election results and discuss, move to discuss voter suppression, also known as the Southern Question in the Reconstruction era, and finally identify the main takeaway from the election of 1876. I will be showing visuals, and the first one is this of the Republican candidates. The election of 1876 occurred in the midst of America's celebration of its 100th birthday. And that's why it's often referred to as 1876, the Centennial Election. On May 10th of that year, the Centennial Exposition opened appropriately in Philadelphia's Fairmount Park, where between May and November, almost 8.5 million Americans flocked to marvel at the still young country's accomplishments on display in technology and industry, in agriculture, and many other areas. But all was not well in the country during the 1870s, still suffering the effects of the first major industrial depression of 1873, enduring massive strikes, protests, the rise of third-party movements, all challenging the primacy of the two major political parties, that would be the Republicans and the Democrats. The Republicans, who had held the reign of power in the national government since 1860, were expected to lose. What? The party that won the Civil War, secured freedom made freedom national, oversaw Reconstruction and ushered in the age of big business, lose? Incredible. Well, there was a reason. President Ulysses S. Grant's second term was concluding amid a storm of controversy over scandals, corruption, and charges of quote unquote militarism. One bad sign came in 1874 when the Democrats recaptured the House of Representatives. In the summer of 1876, both Republicans and Democrats held their conventions, with Republicans selecting former Civil War general and Ohioan Rutherford B. Hayes, whose handsome picture you see before you. He looks like almost every other 19th century president, but he has a great first name. Well, he was their presidential candidate and New York's William Wheeler, the vice president. Hayes made a promise to be a one-term president. Although a strong supporter of Black rights, at least in the past, Hayes appeared to be very conciliatory toward ex-Confederate Southern states and very willing to listen to their complaints. The Democrats, and move the slide to the next one, chose former New York governor and anti-corruption fighter Samuel J. Tilden as their candidate, with Indiana's Thomas Hendricks for vice president. Tilden, who did not serve in the Civil War, was considered a strong civil service reformer with a stellar reputation for honesty, something that contrasted with the current holder of the White House. Tilden promised an end to Reconstruction and a restoration of home rule, quote unquote, in the South. It must be mentioned that by 1872, most white males in the South who were previously disqualified from voting could vote again. And so by 1876, 8 of the former Confederate states had been redeemed. And all that means, home rule and redemption, all it means is that the southern part of the Democratic Party now was able to take control. By 1875, federal troops had left all the southern states except Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina, which still had the biracial governments the Republicans had so hoped to be permanent and ensure their relevancy as a strong party in the South. To ensure Democratic victories in Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina, though, in this election of 1876, whites resorted to violence, intimidation, murder, and mayhem to keep Blacks from voting. Could you go to the next slide? This is by the famous cartoonist Thomas Nash, and the title is, "Of course he wants you to vote the Democratic ticket." There's no point in being coy about what this illustration means. Just a few examples of the violence and intimidation. In Hamburg, South Carolina, a militia group known as the Red Shirts gunned down 4 Black men, including the Black Town Marshal. The Hamburg Massacre, as it came to be called, set the tone for many weeks of violence leading up to the elections. And the number of instances I can give you would make you sick, but you get the idea. Could I have the next one as well? Here you have depicted a brave Black voter facing the Ku Klux Klan and ex-Confederates stopping him from voting. There were also, just to give a little bit of a sample, beyond Hamburg, there were counties in Louisiana where the majority of registered voters were Black, but the election results showed almost no votes for Republicans. Ballot boxes across this area were stuffed with Democratic votes. The campaign itself was hard fought with both sides, voters on both sides turning out big time. In fact, 81.8% of the electorate turned out, still unequaled. As the returns came in on November 7th, the results showed that Tilden, Samuel Tilden, Democrat, won a narrow majority of the popular vote and a sizable majority in the Electoral College. In the Electoral College, he won 184, only 1 short of the necessary 185. Hayes won in the Electoral College 165, 20 short of a majority. By the way, the Democrats in this election would retain control of the House of Representatives, and the Republicans would retain control of the Senate in the new Congress. Soon, however, in fact, the night of the election on November 7th, Republicans were alerted to irregular votes in guess which states? You guessed it, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. And those 3 states combined for an electoral total of 19. In addition, Democrats challenged Oregon's 1 electoral vote, which went to the Republican Party. Hayes would need 20 electoral votes to win, and Tilden only 1. On December 6, 1876, the Electoral College met in all the states and cast ballots for president and vice president. Results were certified, sent to Congress, and with the 2 sets of results returned for Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Oregon. Votes for 3 southern states and Oregon were disputed. After much heated discussion, I wish I could give more lurid details, but I can't. After much heated discussion in both the Senate and the House on January 25th, 1877, the Senate passed a bill that established a 15-member commission. 5 senators, 5 representatives, and 5 Supreme Court justices to settle the issues. The commission was advertised as being neutral. However, 8 out of the 15 were Republicans, and the commission decided that Hayes was the winner. See, there, it must be said at this time, part of the interesting part of this election is that there were some secret meetings, one particularly important one, between Democrats and Republicans working out a compromise. Rutherford B. Hayes was elected president by a margin of 1 electoral vote and was sworn in on March 5th, 1877. There would be a long wait between the election results and the inauguration until, I believe, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's tenure. Anyway, victory over Tilden brought to a close the most disputed presidential election in the history of the United States. And I still think that it probably is. From the Democratic viewpoint, this was a fraud. Could you please forward the, there you go. That is the Democratic cartoon mocking Hayes riding the donkey in Louisiana to his fraudulency presidency. In fact, he was always called by Democrats his fraudulency. And can you see the next one? The angry Democrats, this is an example of an angry Democratic cartoon, Tilden or Blood. Can we have the next one? Because I want you to be able to see a map of the election. By the way, the popular vote was fairly close, just 200,000, unlike the original electoral vote. Well, what are some takeaways from this fateful election? It offered this lesson: voter suppression didn't work this time, but it was okay in the future. It marked the end of Reconstruction, the classic end of Reconstruction that came with the so-called Compromise of 1877, in which Republicans and Democrats agreed that the solutions of race should be left to state governments. In the spring of 1877, Rutherford B. Hayes removes all the remaining federal troops in the South. All of the states, southern states, were redeemed. All of them had ex-Confederates in control as well as voting. This would be shortly by the era, followed by the era of Jim Crow. Republicans gave up pretty much on the South. As you can see, the number of territories that remained for them to claim and bring in as states, most of the Western territories were on the side of Republicans, including Colorado, called the Centennial State because its 3 electoral votes certified the win for Hayes, and they came in just before the election was held. So what is like the Centennial Election, and you can end on this slide, what was similar and what was different about the election? The election of 1876 is often compared to the election of 2000 because of the prominence of Florida and other issues. But what about 2020? It seems that both eras were in the frenzy of craziness. It seems that the opposite happened. That the Democrats actually attempted to impeach Grant on the same charges as leading an insurrection in the South against Southern whites, good Southern white Democrats voters. And Republicans did not try and suppress the Black vote in 1876. No states were in 2020 were accused of the kind of fraud and had the evidence that they had in 1876. Well, I hope you enjoyed this short visit through history in this incredible election, one of many, by the way, in the 19th century, which is similarly vexed and fateful. Thank you very much.
Hi, it's really delightful to be here, and thank you all for being here tonight. I agree with Joan that 1870 few elections hold a candle to 1876. But I thought that I'd focus in on the election of 1932 because there are a number of similarities. Could you move to the next slide, please? It's a election in which a one-termer went to defeat. Interestingly, the defeat of Herbert Hoover at the hands of Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the first time, or the only time in the 20th century, that a incumbent president had been defeated without a third party candidate in the mix. So really only Donald Trump versus Biden and Hoover versus Roosevelt have this distinct parallel. I'm leaving out Gerald Ford because he was not elected. He was not running for re-election. So there's a comparable, and obviously there's a contrast in terms of the immensity of the electoral vote that was garnered by the challenger, Franklin Roosevelt, the Democrat, 472 electoral votes to Herbert Hoover's 59, a repudiation of the incumbent president. So why was that? Why was Hoover so decisively rejected? Herbert Hoover was someone who, like Donald Trump, had been in the public eye long before he became president. He had been widely admired for his roles during running the Food Administration during World War I, as a self-made millionaire, as a very successful man in business and then in politics, as the great engineer, someone who could seem to fix any problem that was set to him. But the Great Depression was of a magnitude that he could not fix. It was a crisis that really transcended the existing economic toolkit. All of the ways in which the United States had battled different panics and depressions and other aberrations of the market in the 19th century and the early 20th century, all those were confounded by the depths of the Great Depression, its global nature, the many different scales on which it was operating, and it revealed the fragility of the 1920s prosperity on which Hoover had run in 1928, saying, you will never lack a loaf, a chicken in every pot. All those promises that the prosperity of the 1920s would continue, and then that is very quickly falls apart, not too far into his term. But it wasn't simply just the grim statistics. The unemployment reaches 25% in the later months of 1932. In contrast, the highest in 2020, in the shutdown of the late spring, we got to about 15% national unemployment. So this is a crisis of great magnitude. But it's also the talents of Franklin Roosevelt, his challenger, of coming in with not only a set of fresh ideas, a really kind of a very different progressive vision, a vision that's so progressive, so perhaps radical, that Hoover initially does not take Roosevelt very seriously as his competition. He's rather glad that Roosevelt ends up being the nominee because his ideas are so far out there, he doesn't think he's going to win. Hoover and Roosevelt also have a long acquaintance that dates back to the First World War. Hoover doesn't think very much of Franklin Roosevelt, thinks he's a lightweight, and doesn't think that is quite surprised and quite upset by the fact that this man wins and that he wins so decisively. Can you move to the next screen, please? So unlike Donald Trump, Herbert Hoover readily conceded the election. By 10 p.m. California time on election night, he is telegramming Roosevelt and saying, "I wish you well," and on we go. But that was probably about the nicest correspondence the two men had in the months that followed. As mentioned before, inauguration does not happen until early March. So it is a very long interregnum, and it's happening amid these multiple crises of international debt, crises of domestic policy, crises of the financial system of every layer, federal, state, and local. And the two men have very, very different ideas about what the remedy is to that crisis. Hoover does not like the New Deal that Franklin Roosevelt's proposing on the campaign trail. He likes it even less after Roosevelt's win. And he also sees some political advantage to be gained for his future post-presidency life in saddling Roosevelt as quickly as possible with the thorny problems of the Great Depression and its associated challenges, and positioning himself as a critic of the New Deal and someone who is making Roosevelt, sort of setting up Roosevelt to fail. and this characterizes all of their interactions. Unlike Donald Trump and Joe Biden, there are a number of moments when the two men meet during the transition. There is a meeting in the White House in November in which Hoover lectures Roosevelt about international debt and debt reparations and all of the challenges ahead of him. And Roosevelt, as he does, nods a lot and looks encouraging, and then promises nothing at all. And quickly comes out after saying, I didn't agree to anything. This is all Herbert Hoover's problem. He's still president until March. There is a testy exchange of telegrams that are published in newspapers around the world in December over this question of whether the United States should continue its allow European debtors. This is all about the debt from World War I. Kind of forgive debts or let them have a hiatus during this global economic crisis. There is another meeting in the White House in January. Doesn't go very well. There's an exchange of letters in February. Hoover sends a kind of snippy letter to Roosevelt. Roosevelt doesn't respond for 12 days. It goes back and forth, back and forth. So it's a matter of policy, and it's a matter of personal animosity that seems to be growing with every week of the transition. So by the time we get to the inaugural, if you could move to the next slide, the two men who once were on pretty good terms do not speak as they ride in the car all the way from the White House to the Capitol. It is a very tense moment and a changing of the guard. And Herbert Hoover's opposition to the New Deal becomes more and more firm with every moment through this transition period, and then in his post-presidency. Similar to some of the rhetoric on the campaign trail in 2020, there are accusations by Hoover and by his allies that the New Deal is simply socialism, Bolshevism, that this is un-American, and that it will be disastrous for the country if Roosevelt is allowed to govern as he would like. If you can move to the very last slide, please. And the significance of this transition period is not simply what happens between November and March, but it also is what happens in the 3 decades after, because Herbert Hoover lives a very long life. He is in his 50s as he leaves the presidency. He lives until the early 60s. He retires to California, to Stanford, to the campus of Stanford. And from there, with his writings, with his speeches, with his bringing people together to talk about an alternative vision, conservative vision of where the country should go, becomes one of the New Deal's fiercest critics and a critical mobilizer of a conservative movement to come. So I think that what we take away from this consequential transition, which really, to be clear, the 2020-21 transition makes this the contentious nature of the Roosevelt-Hoover feud fade away. There is not violence. There is a concession, a recognition of the win of the challenger. But I think the fact that it's happening in a grave economic crisis has some striking parallels to right now. We're grappling with COVID-19, more than 4,000 Americans dying per day at this point. And a crisis that is not reckoned with. Employment stays at 25% by the time Roosevelt's inaugurated. Very little headway has been made on a program of recovery. It's all up to Roosevelt to take it on. And there's a very long political shadow. We are still fighting over the New Deal. We are still fighting over what should the government do and how big should it be and who should it serve. And so we still see the ghosts of 1932 and 33 with us, even though its progenitors are long gone. And I'll leave it there.
Okay. Yes. Joan, come back. That was amazing, both of you. What I want to do is pose a few questions, if you don't mind. I actually want to start. with Joan, if you can say a little bit more about, I guess, two basic questions that kind of tie together. I mean, is it fair to say that Hayes would have won had there been no violent voter suppression of Black voters in the South? In other words, given what happened in Colfax, Louisiana, and Meridian, Mississippi, just given the violent repression of Black voters, would Hayes have won outright? And then linked to that, why do you think it took so long before state constitutions were rewritten to disenfranchise Black voters? It's like 15, 20 years later, instead of say right in after 1877.
Thank you, Robin, for those excellent questions. And I've done a lot of thinking and have consulted many works about the Hayes-Tilden election. It's hard to say. I personally think that if all of the suppressed Black votes were counted, that Hayes would have won, not by much. The key here is, what's interesting is that the number of men of voting in across the North and the South, and I suppose in the Western territories too, in the 1870s declined, because voters just weren't inspired for one reason or the other. For some reason, even with what we consider two uninspiring candidates, Hayes and Tilden, who couldn't necessarily give a good speech to save their lives, voters came out in record numbers, and that includes many of the white voters in the South, male vote. I need not say it's all male voters, who were not only disqualified, but they were also discouraged from voting. And also there were a number of what were called scalawags who voted for the radical Republican government because they thought that they would benefit too. That by 1876, that had sort of been awash in the kind of corruption and other issues that were convulsing the nation, and certainly in the South. However, having said all that, I do think that Hayes would have won. And I think one thing is to keep in mind is that in 1880, the Republicans won another election. James Garfield, yet another ex-general who was assassinated shortly after. I mean, when you think of it, Margaret did such a good job in portraying the turmoil that we face today after this horrible economic and health crisis that we've been in. And the people of that generation had been through quite a lot as well.
Right.
The Civil War, what could be worse than a civil war in which one part of the nation engaged in war on the other, and over 5 million men were killed, and I mean the toll was tremendous. So there were all kinds of adjustments to be made there. Your second question about why did it take the Southern states so long to institute Jim Crow in the law, I think that to a certain extent it took that long, beginning in the 1890s, right, with the Mississippi Plan. It took that long for the Democrats to feel confident that they could get it through, and without because Black Republicans were still voting. They did vote in the 1876 election. They were still part of the Republican Party. Black Republicans in the Southern states, for example, would send members to the convention and vote for the president, to choose the president. So it was, I think it took until then for it really to be solidified. Yeah.
Well, thank you. So Margaret, why do you think, I mean, it's interesting to compare 1932 to 2020 because, or even 2016, because Hoover, whether it's exaggerated or not, Hoover he represented big business in some ways. At least that was symbolically, he was big business. Whereas Roosevelt, though Roosevelt was business friendly, wasn't perceived that way. 2016, we want a CEO, not we. I didn't vote for Trump, but this idea that somehow big business will save us. Why do you think Hoover lost so badly And those electoral votes are all concentrated in the Northeast.
Hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, it reflected the remarkable electoral maps. Nothing better than those maps to show the change of the party strongholds over time, right?
Mhm.
You know, when you could like show people like the Northeast used to be all Republican, like this was a stronghold. And it reflected what the Republican Party was, which was a business, and it was a very different Republican Party than now,
Right.
although there are some commonalities. I think that, Hoover was, but I think that the commonalities are they're both change elections, right? So you have, and change candidates are the ones who usually win again and again, and including when incumbents can successfully make a case that they are making change and should be continued to make
Right.
change. So Hoover was the establishment figure. Roosevelt was the figure of change. Roosevelt was, the irony, of course, is Hoover's a poor boy from Iowa,
Right.
who, went to Stanford because the tuition was free then, and was a self-made man, which I
Right.
think very much colored his thinking. And Roosevelt was, a rich guy, and there were called the traitor to his class when he
Mhm.
comes in and immediately starts doing things that the wealthy are not favored by. And so Roosevelt is promising, the speeches of, broadcast on the radio, speaking to the forgotten man, talking about, and it's the, never let a good crisis go to waste, right?
Mhm.
The enormity of the Great Depression, its tenacity, and the fact that unlike our COVID recession, it was very broadly felt. You had people who never thought they would be economically insecure are suddenly, they've lost their home, they've lost their job. And so this is, parallels to 2016. Donald Trump was a businessman, but he is not a big business, he's not a Fortune 50, establishment kind.
Right.
He's not Jamie Dimon or somebody, or Bob Rubin. He's the change candidate. He is playing on this dissatisfaction with both major parties and the failure by both major parties to truly address inequalities and inequities and problems they've been promising to fix for a long time. And he's there are people voting for him in 2016. They're like, well, the mainstream guys didn't help me. I'm just going to turn the table over and see what happens.
Right, exactly. It's interesting. This is a commentary before I ask my other question. You mentioned debt, and I thought also for Joan how the Civil War debt was a huge issue.
Huge.
And so with a point where the readjusters were coming to power in part, around the question of debt and canceling debt. And so it's just interesting how even in 2020, the COVID crisis, the shutdown, we're dealing with a debt crisis now. And debt is always looming large, I guess, and that's just the nature of capitalism, but these particular transitional periods, debt looms large. But that's not my question. So I have a question for both of you, and bear with me here because this is my little controversial question. Now I'm thinking about the way in which both periods are also characterized by radical insurgencies. So think about the 1876 election, then 1877, the Great Railroad Strike, the St. Louis Commune, we think of the South, but throughout the country, there's like massive left-wing, movements, the Knights of Labor and others are emerging in that moment. And then 1932, you've got both the resurgence or the emergence in some ways of the Communist Party and the black shirts in Georgia and the American Nazi Party. In other words, there are other kinds of pressures and forces. They may not be the majority, but they constitute the context for trying to manage crises. And I'm wondering if both of you could talk about the way in which radical politics and labor politics in particular plays out in both, in the case of 1876, the governance of the Hayes regime, but then also for Roosevelt, his election and the governance under Roosevelt with this pressure from the left and from this emerging, fascist movement elsewhere. So either one could jump in on that question.
Joan, you want to go first?
First of all, I'm a Californian, born and raised, and still live here, and I love debt. That's who we are. However, I think that you touched on a really excellent point. I'm not surprised, Robin. The fact is that it's never simple in American politics and American political culture and American society. There were many radical movements. That the idea that the rise of big business had no pushback is absurd. That they had their way? No, they didn't. There's no period in our history that had more strikes than the Gilded Age. And I could just, the Homestead strike and the Pullman strike, the Great Railroad strike of 1877, as you mentioned, these were huge strikes and lots of protests. Unions were not very successful, but that provided a entryway into the dialogue, because just as big business was developing its language and its mastery, so were protests. Now in America, there were all kinds of different protest groups. There were the populist movement was huge. Right. That is the largest mass movement in my opinion to ever, I mean, grassroots mass movement that we've ever had. And it for a while it involved the majority of the American people who worked in farming, labor. They tried to make they tried to encompass working class, but it didn't work so well, but it was just massive. And they had their own party, they had third parties, they had their own leaders. And Sockless Jerry Simpson in you know what, Kansas, it was Kansas. And it was just, it's a fascinating time. And these of course had impact on the two major political parties. They managed to subvert the radical movements by adopting platform, as in the famous election of 1896, where the Democrats did not run exactly as populist, but their candidate, William Jennings Bryan, appealed into a populist audience. Right. It was always the danger. And it's something I think that renews our political parties in some ways.
Right. Thank you. Margaret.
Yeah, I mean, 1877, you want to talk about a crazy moment in American history, like let's go to 1877. We might be trying to surpass it in 2021, but hope not. I think you're right. I think it's very interesting. The sort of radical politics is kind of operating on this interesting spectrum, and kind of populism itself by the 20s and 30s is kind of on this spectrum that is from where we sit now, kind of hard to peg in the right and the left. I mean, look, the Roosevelt is elected in a decade that follows the 1920s, when the second Ku Klux Klan became a national movement, an anti-immigrant, anti-Black, anti-Catholic, anti-Semitic, but kind of mainstream Rotary Club style movement. And what I find very interesting is how you have this crescendo of membership, and then it kind of goes away. Like that is something that could turned into, an American fascist party at scale. And the New Deal, what happens in the 30s clearly tamps it down. And the material benefits of the New Deal, I would argue, are part of that. There also are these radical politics that give space for the Roosevelt administration to do what it does. First of all, the Roosevelt administration, the New Deal is progressive politics, ideas that had been kicking around since the Gilded Age and been experimented at the state and local level. And you have figures like Francis Perkins, who are, reformers themselves, and others, many others, who are, have spent the first decades of the 20th century in places like New York City and New York State, and then are working for Roosevelt when he's governor of New York, and then come in and go at the national level. And the crisis of the Great Depression creates space for these policies. Same with labor organizing. You have an immense, you have a labor movement that has gathered momentum. You have decades of activism. Right. And then you have this space where you now have an administration that is supporting the right to organize. And so this is the beginning of the golden age of American trade unionism. You see this transformation in these industrial hubs like Detroit and the auto industry. So there's again, a crisis creates opportunity for the aperture of political possibility to change, to open. And also you have multiple movements and voices that are not all kind of a straight shooter, good guy, bad guy.
Right.
and
Yeah.
and it's a fascinating moment to excavate, because we see in this swirl how radical ideas once considered radical become policy.
Right.
And also how they're pushed back against, but how they do become institutionalized.
Right. Yeah, it's hard to imagine, the National Industrial Recovery Administration or the Act or Section 7A without a robust labor movement, without demands for the unemployed, the bonus march. I mean, all these things are
Bonus
happening,
march.
And it's interesting to think also about 2020, 2021. We're obsessed right now with the events of January 6th, but the summer of 2020, 26 million people came out in the streets to basically resist police violence. The Democratic Socialists of America is bigger than it has ever been in its history. They're running candidates who are winning elections. There's a kind of robust left socialist alternative emerging. And in response to that, we see this kind of fascist insurgency. So there's so many parallels and similarities that it's quite striking. But, maybe the lesson is that they've been there. The question is, at what point do they bubble up? And at what point are they kind of dormant? Okay, so let me, since our time's moving, I have a question from one of the many people who are watching this. And I'm just going to read the question. I have a million of my own questions, but I'll save those. But so someone asked, it says, I'm curious what the panel thinks about the impact this election and transition will have on future cycles. Will we return to a gracious and helpful transition, or will Trump's behavior lead to a continued degeneration of the election and transition process? Of course, as historians, you're asked to predict the future. That's our job, right? So that's the question. Both of you could jump in.
All I can say is right now it looks a little bit dim that would happen, because the two sides are so polarized and there's no middle ground. There doesn't seem to be any middle ground where we can come together as a country, or as a Democrat or Republican, or a college student or a townie, so to speak. I mean,
Right.
all these we've been seeing all these divides more than we've been seeing opportunities for compromise and working together. And all I can say is that as with COVID, someday this too will pass. I mean, that's a prediction I would make as an historian, that there has not been a fateful election every single election. and I'm trying to think of boring presidencies. And one thinks of one that's been traditionally celebrated as a boring presidency, and that's Dwight D. Eisenhower's 2 terms in office. And yet it was anything but boring, wasn't it?
Right.
I mean, really, when you study it. But compared to today, I certainly hope that we can come together more fruitfully in the future.
Right.
Yeah, I agree. We don't have sequential fateful elections. And I think what's making this so combustible now has to do with the people involved, the person involved, the incumbent, Donald Trump himself, which is he's redefined and kind of pushed the boundaries of the presidency as a whole. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the next several years to kind of pull those back, where just as in the wake of Nixon, there was an effort to, limit this overreach of the executive and contain the imperial presidency as it had become. And it also, I think, let's also think about our means of communication and the
Right.
platforms. When I'm not talking about presidents, I'm talking about tech and the role of the large tech platforms and social media platforms is not the only thing that has caused this combustible moment. But it has been a match that's lit the fire. It has allowed, Robin, as you observed, these impulses are always there in our culture. The people are always there, but this has been, look, Facebook's been a very handy way for conspiracy theorists and white supremacists to find each other. And that's the
Right.
very uncomfortable truth, and other platforms as well. But that, we have So I would imagine, it's hard to see this kind of becoming the norm because we've had this very unusual president and presidency.
Right, right. That brings me to the question that was sort of in the back of my mind. And just to follow up on the question of communications, it was wonderful to see the slides for both of you and to see the way in which certain imagery and certain kind of dog whistle politics continues. I mean, the fact that in the South in the 1870s and 80s, you had like the white man's party, in Texas, for example. I mean, they were unambiguous about who they stood for. So you think about, today, and I really want to get both of you to respond to this. Social media is such a powerful means to produce misinformation, disinformation fast. I mean, disinformation is not new, but the spread of disinformation and the willingness to literally make claims that there's no basis in truth. People have been writing about this as a post-truth regime, a post-truth moment. Can we attribute that just to the technology? And we certainly can't attribute just to Trump, but just to technology. And if not, or if so, does this is this kind of a foreboding of what's to come in future elections, not just national elections, but local elections, where people just make up stuff and use that as a basis for disparaging a candidate, for inventing things? And if that's the case, then where does truth does it have any, what do facts, what role do facts play in our electoral politics?
Well, I'll answer first, and that is this is something I've given a lot of thought to in the elections that I've studied as an historian, but certainly living through this, I think Margaret is absolutely right about social media, but I would say that any student of the election of 1800 or 1824 or 28 would find a huge number of lies being propagated, and the newspapers were party organs for the most part. And having read a lot of the newspaper's account of Ulysses S. Grant and President Grant, and this was on both sides, the lies hurled, they just made stuff up. And Robin, I hope that voters themselves would be able to make intelligent decisions based on reading a variety of sources and watching a variety of sources. And I know the students in our classes go out educated. And so I do think there's hope that this will not continue. The problem is that the instantaneous nature of these lies.
Yeah, we had a, print culture of the 19th century did not have the scope and the scale and the virality of what we have now. And look, that I think we need to recognize that the sort of disinformation, this environment, it precedes Trump. It has more inputs than simply social media. There's also cable news, there are other things. And I think it relates to the broader distrust of expertise that's been, growing in American culture, at least since the 1960s. It's a product of Vietnam and Watergate and the failure of the breakdown of trust and decentering the expert authority, and certainly the rise of the communications media we use and the ability of everyone to have their soapbox on which they stand and they express their opinion. And when you have everyone doing it at once, the loudest opinions, the people who shout the loudest get heard. And if if you're really angry, you get heard even more. We experience these social media platforms were designed to sell ads on the internet. They were not designed to be political communication platforms at all. And so they're really, that's the basic incompatibility. They're designed to engage us maximally so that more ads can be sold against our data and that we will buy things. And when you do that, what engages us? It engages, the most outrageous talk, and because it's also beautifully designed in a way that you can't tell a New York Times article that's adhering to journalistic standards, you can't distinguish that from something that your second cousin posts on Facebook that's not based and anchored in any truth.
Right.
It becomes harder to distinguish. I do think we will, if anything that we take from this pandemic year, I hope that this is a kind of recognition to make government great again and to make expertise great again. We're seeing the consequences of this sort of 40-year deterioration of investment in things like public health.
Right.
I really do hope that this is, again, we aren't here to do predictions, but if we look at the longer contours, we do see these kind of waxing and waning of the public and private balance, and they do need to be more in balance than they are.
Right, right. Well, let me just say, I know we got about 2 minutes, but let me just throw one thing, last thing out, which is on this question of expertise, but I think you made a really, really important point. It's interesting because my understanding is that one of the critiques of expertise comes from the anti-war movement that said, look, why should foreign policy be in the hands of people in the Pentagon who make decisions about our lives in the age of nuclear threat? So the idea was that, foreign policy should be democratized. We should know something about weapon systems and why they're terrible, and we should have more transparency. So the irony is that the very privatization you talked about over the last 40 years of everything, I mean, whether it's venture capital in emergency rooms, or whether it's, the privatization of public institutions like universities, the privatization of knowledge has actually made it less possible for people to be able to get access through transparency to become kind of public, I wouldn't say experts, but public participants in governance. And it's just a weird moment where governance, we think we're becoming more democratic, but actually we're becoming less and less democratic. And the institutions being attacked, we think are the institutions of democracy, are the halls that have kept us out. And so, I'm just wondering, in terms of last thoughts, because all of our discussions today, both of your brilliant presentations, have been not about elections. It's part of it. It's about democracy. What is the state of democracy in this moment, in the moment of crisis in 1932, in the moment of crisis at the end of the Civil War, at the end of Reconstruction, the moment of crisis in 2021? What is the future of democracy? How can we keep it robust? What needs to be done? So, last words. What needs to be done to keep our democracy robust, or to make it more robust, in your opinion?
Well, you just keep throwing out easier and easier questions. And I'm just going to knock that out of the park and just hand it over to Margaret. No, I will say again that having grown up in a generation which protested war, which viewed everything coming out of the Pentagon and the State Department as suspect, and taught to distrust, not obliterate authority, but distrust, and certainly college protests show that. I mean, the fact is that protest is healthy in our country, very healthy, if last summer is to be any guide. And all I can say is that I'm an optimist. I think that we'll work this out. We'll get through this like we've gotten through all the other difficult periods, even more difficult than this, believe it or not. And to think of it as a worldwide phenomenon as well. Everyone is under COVID, and in many countries, there are populist movements which have appeared before COVID took place. But what is the meaning of all this? And maybe it's time for some self-reflection on the part of experts on how to deal with this.
Yeah, I think, taking a hard and honest look at history, and American history in particular, can be very uncomfortable and can be a real downer. And it can be a very sort of these ugly truths are very, very hard to reckon with. But I too, like Joan, I refuse to be a pessimist. I think that history, there's plenty of evidence in American history alone to give us reason for optimism and hope. And what moves the needle? What moves the needle towards justice, towards democracy? It has been an imperfect democracy from the start. but there has been a lot of work done to make it better. And it has been a 2 steps forward, 1 step back at times.
Mhm.
There have been moments of grave crisis, but sometimes crises kind of shake up the system so much that you move past things. What makes the difference? It's a combination of activism from the bottom up, sustained activism at the grassroots, and leadership and leaders that listen to respond to that activism. I think part of what we're going through here is just, we have had in the modern era, the American president is the most important job in the world, and American presidents of both parties have governed in a way to attempt to bind people together, bind Americans together, and to varying degrees find some common ground in the world. We are coming off of 4 years with someone who governed the opposite way.
Mhm.
And that has exacerbated our existing fractures. So I am hopeful that the activism we saw on January 5th, what
Mhm.
that resulted in,
Right.
the sustained activism we saw last summer, all sorts of activism and activation of, think about the college students we teach and how they are tuned into this
Right.
and engaged, and that being matched with leadership. I would like to be hopeful and looking towards the future for better times to come. Let's
Right.
see.
Well, everyone heard it here. Optimism. The future is in our hands. Anyway, thank you so much, Margaret and Joan, for this wonderful conversation. And I hope people could take away and make sure that, when you leave, you go out and get their books and read them. And you could get one of mine if you want. So, okay. So I think we're done, right? I don't know if anyone's going to come back in.
Thank
So,
you.
thanks a lot.
Thank
Okay,
you
see you later.
all.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.